Not just collected fragments from elsewhere, but reflections of her own emerging dreams. The cafe below hummed with its new role as a dimensional crossing point, but now it carried an additional layer of meaning. Luna's permission to dream seemed to strengthen the pathways between gentle realities, making it easier for compassion to flow between worlds. Customers began leaving notes that spoke not just of comfort received, but of inspiration awakened. Evidence that witnessing someone else's courage to hope could kindle the same courage in others. When Luna finally descended the garden stairs, she carried with her the glowing jar of her own dreams, the small pot of planted seeds, and most importantly, the understanding that her gift for helping others find their hopes had been incomplete without learning to nurture her own. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light and held it like a promise, while Luna's map of gentle worlds pulsed with new pathways, routes that led not just to other realities, but to the infinite possibilities that opened when someone finally gave themselves permission to dream. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, another profound lesson had been learned. Luna had discovered that the most generous act wasn't always to give others what they needed, but sometimes to model for them what it looked like to tend your own hopes with the same reverence you brought to everyone else's. Her empty jar now glowed with steady, peaceful light, not a whisper from elsewhere, but the sound of her own heart finally learning to speak its truth into the patient darkness, ready to be heard by anyone who needed to remember that their own dreams were worthy of the same careful attention they offered to others. Outside, the evening wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, and among them, for the first time, were fragments of Luna's own hopes, dreams that had learned to trust themselves enough to take flight, ready to be collected by other gentle souls who needed to remember that the most important library they could build was the one that held space for their own beautiful, impossible longings. The morning after Luna had learned to tend her own dreams brought with it a quality of light that seemed to carry whispers of transformation, and it was Mrs. Alvarez at the town library who first noticed that something fundamental had shifted in the quiet spaces where stories lived. She arrived to find that the familiar building breathed differently, as if the very air had grown more attentive, more receptive to the possibility that books could be more than repositories of words. They could become sanctuaries for the stories. That almost were. Luna felt the pull immediately when she passed the library on her way to the cafe, her newly planted seeds secure in their small pot, and her dream jar glowing with steady, peaceful light. The building's windows seemed to catch the morning sun differently, holding light the way cupped hands hold water, and she found herself drawn up the worn stone steps with the same inevitability that had once guided her to collect whispers from the wind. "There's something upstairs," Mrs. Alvarez murmured as Luna entered, her voice carrying the particular wonder of someone who had spent decades among books and suddenly discovered they were capable of new conversations. A section that wasn't there yesterday, but feels like it's been waiting for years. Books that seem to be writing themselves, stories that taste of recognition without quite achieving the clarity of actual memory. The climb to the second floor felt like ascending between worlds, each step carrying Luna deeper into the understanding that her permission to dream had created ripples that reached far beyond her own heart. When she pushed open the door to the local history section, the space that greeted her had expanded in ways that defied the building's modest architecture, filled with shelves that seemed to breathe with their own quiet purpose. The books themselves were bound in soft leather the color of twilight, their spines bearing titles that shifted and settled as she watched, words arranging themselves according to the needs of whoever approached them. The grandfather who built lullabies. Instead of weapons, adventures in gentle dimensions where every conflict finds understanding. The universe where intelligence learned to whisper. Each volume hummed with the same frequency as Luna's whisper jars, as if they contained fragments of the same infinite conversation between realities where kindness had learned to be the loudest sound. When Ori and Samuel arrived, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had guided Luna, they found her seated at a reading table scarred by years of gentle use, surrounded by books that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The air around her shimmered with the same quality they had learned to recognize when the cafe's dimensional pathways opened, but softer, more stable, as if this transformation was meant to be permanent rather than fleeting. "These are the almost memories," Luna explained, her voice thick with wonder as she opened a volume whose pages exhaled the faint scent of rosemary and the clean brightness of morning light. "The stories from the gentle worlds, the versions where different choices led to different outcomes. They're collecting here because someone finally created space for them to exist." Ori approached the nearest shelf with the reverence they brought to the cutting board, sensing immediately that these books were alive in the same way Mira's impossible plants were alive, responsive to attention, generous with their gifts when approached with the right kind of listening. When they touched a spine labeled "The Scientist Who Remembered How to Be Kind," warmth spread through their palm, and they felt the familiar sensation of emotional architecture adjusting itself, making space for healing to occur. The story within was of a brilliant mind, wild-haired and endlessly curious, whose intelligence had chosen to serve connection rather than conquest. In this gentle version, portal technology had been developed not for escape or dominance, but for sharing, devices that could carry comfort to places where it was needed most, inventions that helped families understand each other's unspoken longings, experiments in the alchemy of human kindness that made the multiverse a more beautiful place rather than a more dangerous one. Samuel discovered a section devoted to stories of nourishment, tales of cafes where every meal was prepared with gratitude, where cooking was considered a form of prayer, where the simple act of feeding someone became a profound expression of love. As he read, he felt the familiar rightness settle deep in his chest, the same sensation he experienced when the espresso machine found its perfect rhythm or when a sandwich emerged exactly as someone needed it to be. Mrs. Chen, arriving for her morning constitutional, found herself drawn to a volume whose cover depicted a garden where flowers bloomed in impossible seasons, tended by hands that understood the language of growing things. The sister who taught children how to listen to plants. As she read, tears flowed freely down her cheeks, but they were different tears now, not the bitter salt of loss, but the cleaner flow of grief that had found a gentle alternative to despair. Proof that love continued its work, even when separated. By the thin membrane between what was and what could have been, the library revealed its deeper purpose as the morning progressed. Each book seemed to respond to the emotional climate of its readers, pages turning themselves to exactly the passages that needed to be found, stories adjusting their emphasis to address the particular hungers of whoever approached them. When Dr. Martinez arrived during his lunch break, drawn by reports of the transformation, he found waiting for him tales of medicine practiced with infinite patience, realities where healing was understood as a conversation between doctor and patient rather than a battle against symptoms. Luna's whisper jars, responding to the library's presence, began to pulse with unprecedented brightness, their contained light seeming to flow between the books like luminous threads connecting all. The gentle possibilities. She understood now that her collection had been preparing for this moment. Each whisper she had saved was a fragment of these larger stories, proof that the almost memories were not fantasies, but living, breathing realities that existed in the spaces between what was and what could be. As afternoon settled over the library like a comfortable blanket, the books began to reveal their most profound gift. They were not just stories to be read, but templates for transformation, blueprints that showed how the familiar struggles of existence could find gentle resolutions. The businessman who had been changed by Ori's sandwiches discovered narratives about boardrooms where collaboration had replaced competition, where success was measured in terms of human flourishing rather than quarterly profits. The young artist, who had found his way back to his canvas with the help of Ori's Riverstone, spent hours sketching characters from the almost memories, his work gaining a new depth as he translated the library's gentle visions into images that could be shared with others. His drawings began to appear around town, murals depicting scenes where families learned to love each other's flaws, where the most complex problems were solved not through force, but through the patient application of understanding. Ori began to understand that the Library of Almost Memories was more than just a collection of alternative stories. It was a living bridge between the cafe's dimensional crossing abilities and the practical work of transformation in their own reality. Each book they read influenced the sandwiches they created, adding layers of flavor that tasted like the gentle possibilities people had just discovered, nourishment that carried the essence of worlds where different choices had led to different outcomes. The espresso machine, now fully attuned to the cafe's expanded consciousness, began producing coffee that carried whispers from the library's stories, cups that tasted like morning conversations in realities where people had time to truly listen to each other, where intelligence had learned to serve love rather than ego, where every interaction was seasoned with the understanding that connection was more valuable than being right. As evening approached and the library settled into its nighttime quiet, Mrs. Alvarez appeared with a small wooden box filled with blank cards. "Return slips," she explained, her eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of a librarian who had discovered a new way to serve her community. "Write down what you remember, what you've learned." The books seem to grow new chapters when they're fed with genuine reflection. Luna wrote carefully on her slip, "A place where you are allowed to arrive with your unfinished story and be welcomed exactly as you are." As she placed it between the pages of a book about families who had learned to communicate in the language of shared meals, the volume seemed to exhale contentment, its pages rustling with the sound of new possibilities taking root. The walk back to the cafe felt like a procession of quiet celebration, each step carrying them deeper into the understanding that Luna's dream had not just taken root, but had begun to bloom in ways that would nourish the entire community. The cutting board gleamed in the evening light, ready for tomorrow's work, but now it carried the promise of something more, sandwiches that would taste like the almost memories people had just discovered, nourishment that could help bridge the gap between what was and what could be. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light and held it like a promise, while Luna's map of gentle worlds pulsed with pathways that now led not just to other realities, but to the infinite possibilities that opened when someone created space for almost memories to become actual hopes. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm another profound transformation had taken root, proof that the most important libraries were not just repositories of what had been written, but sanctuaries for the stories that were still learning how to be true, still waiting patiently for someone to believe in them, enough to make them manifest in the ordinary world where kindness, given the right conditions, could indeed become the most powerful force of all. Outside, the evening wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, and among them were fragments of the stories people had just read, almost memories that were beginning to transform into actual possibilities, gentle alternatives that were learning to take root, wherever someone was brave enough to believe that their most compassionate hopes were not too good to be true, but too true to be ignored any longer. The morning after the Library of Almost Memories had revealed itself brought with it a quality of light that seemed to carry whispers of transformation, and Mira discovered that her impossible garden had responded to the town's gentle awakening by producing its most extraordinary crop yet. She felt it before she saw it. The air on the rooftop held a different pressure, like the moment before a song begins when the silence grows thick with anticipation. The first sign appeared in the lavender patch, where the purple buds had swollen, overnight, with what looked like concentrated starlight. When Mira brushed her fingers against them, they released not just their familiar calming scent, but something more profound, a crystalline chime that hung in the morning air like a note that had learned to be visible, settling directly into her bones with the weight of perfect peace. "Ori," she called softly, her voice carrying the particular wonder of someone who had spent years among growing things and suddenly discovered they were capable of conversations she had never imagined. The gardens learned to sing. The Almost Memories. From the library, they've taught the plants new ways to be generous. When Ori climbed to the rooftop, they found Mira kneeling among beds that seemed to pulse with their own inner music. The chamomile flowers chimed with delicate silver notes when touched by the morning breeze, their small faces turned toward a sky that seemed to listen back. The rosemary hummed with deeper, earthier tones that carried memories of every hand that had ever tended it, every meal it had blessed with its presence. Even the mint, usually content to offer its bright scent to the world, now released tiny, crystalline melodies that sparkled in the air like audible dewdrops. Samuel appeared with his morning tea, drawn by the sound of something unprecedented happening in the space above the cafe. When he heard the garden's new chorus, he paused with the stillness of someone witnessing a miracle that was too beautiful to disturb. "It's like the plants have learned to sing the feelings we don't have words for," he murmured, his voice soft with amazement. "Lullabies for the parts of us that have forgotten how to rest." Luna arrived carrying her collection of whisper jars, their contained light pulsing in rhythm with the garden's melodies. "The whispers are harmonizing," she announced, her dark eyes bright with discovery. The almost memories gave them permission to become more than they were, to offer gifts that exist in the spaces between what we expect and what we need. As the morning progressed, Mira began the delicate work of harvesting these musical blooms. Each flower had to be approached with the same reverence Ori brought to the cutting board, listened to with the whole heart before being gently gathered. She showed Ori how to cut when the light was angled just so, a sliver before mid-morning, when the warmth made the oils rise but the day had not yet asked for too much. Each cut revealed its own small tone. Lavender released a low note that calmed. The bones chamomile chimed like the first clink of a spoon in a cup, and rosemary rang with a clean, steady sound that made the air feel clearer. Luna set one of her whisper jars among the baskets without opening it, and the glass took on the faintest glow, as if catching and saving something more subtle than light. Back in the cafe, Samuel had already made space on the largest table, spreading clean screens for the herbs to dry, their mesh ready to cradle stems and buds without stealing any of their voice. The wooden bird on its shelf turned warm when the first lavender was laid out, the carved feathers holding the memory of hands that worked carefully and meant to care. Mira taught them the quiet ritual she had learned long before the garden began. Its impossible generosity. Some herbs needed to be touched as they dried, turned once then left alone. Others preferred to be forgotten and remembered only at dusk. The lullabies were shy at first, rising within the stems like secrets, but with patient air and the dimming of the noonlight, notes began to lift and settle in the room. Not songs as people sing them, but melodies that knew where to land, a simple repeating phrase that coaxed tight shoulders to unclench, a softer line that held a name without speaking it, a humming shape that remembered the rhythm of rocking. Ori, who had learned to listen to silence, discovered that stirring counterclockwise, slow and steady, invited the lower notes. A quick, careful clockwise brought the brighter ones. A single drop of moonlight water changed the key, not by magic, but the way a window opened at the right angle changes a room's air. Samuel found the cups, whose rims made the best vessel for sound, the sturdy ones for those who needed anchoring, the thin porcelain for those who required gentleness. They began in the late afternoon with small offerings, creating what they quietly named their lullaby harvest tea service. Not advertised with fanfare, but simply offered as a choice, a gentle invitation written on a small card. A cup of peace brewed just for you. Mrs. Chen arrived first, her silver hair catching the early light, and her hands still carrying the gentle grief she had been learning to weave into her daily rhythms. She had spent the morning at the library, reading about dimensions where loss was understood as a deepening of love rather than an ending. When Mira placed a cup before her, chamomile with a whisper of rosemary, just enough to give the lullaby a spine, the steam that rose carried a melody that felt like a quilt her grandmother had made, warm and patient and full of accumulated care. "Let it steep until you can hear it," Mira said softly, and they watched as the steam rose and thickened, then changed in that delicate way that attention can change a familiar thing. Mrs. Chen bowed her head slightly over the cup, and the first thread of melody found her. It wasn't the song her sister had sung as a girl, it didn't pretend to be that. It was something gentler, a tune that made peace with the empty chair by the window, a refrain that allowed love to be present without pain growing louder to keep up. She didn't cry. Her mouth softened into a small, surprised smile that had room for memory, and she took her first sip like a promise she meant to keep. "It sounds like forgiveness," she said after a time, "the kind you give to yourself for still being here when someone you love had to go." The businessman, who had been transformed by Ori's sandwiches, discovered that his lullaby, Rosemary's steadiness with Lavender's permission to let go, sang clean lines at first, an organized melody that matched the grid in his mind. then, gradually, loosened to a rhythm you couldn't schedule, but could lean against. He laughed once, softly and almost embarrassed, at a note that reminded him of the clink of ice in his grandmother's summer tea, and stayed an extra 15 minutes because leaving too quickly would have broken the spell. The young mother, her, baby finally asleep across her chest, received chamomile with a breath of lemon balm, and just a wink of mint to remind her that waking could be kind. The melody lifted and fell with the baby's breathing, and for once she did not scan the room for what might be needed next. She simply let herself be held by a tune that understood her fatigue without naming it. When she left, she placed a folded paper near the register on which she had written in careful letters, "I remembered the sound of my own voice." As evening approached and the garden settled into its nighttime quiet, the plants continued their gentle concert, their melodies weaving through the cooling air like visible threads of comfort. The lullabies had settled into the wood and glass of the cafe, and the room itself learned to hum, not loudly, but with the persistent gentleness of a hand on the shoulder reminding you of your name. Dr. Martinez arrived as stars took their places with a sense of purpose, his day long and marked by the kind of weariness that comes from making small decisions that matter to people who needed more than he could give. His cup, a careful blend that Mira had prepared while thinking of healing hands, sang what he had always wanted medicine to sound like: patient, restorative, full of the understanding that sometimes the most profound cure was simply helping someone remember they deserved to rest. Mira kept a small ledger, not of recipes but of the moments when the notes did what they meant to do. Mrs. Chen's forgiveness song, the baby's breath, mother's remembered voice, grandmother's iced tea laughter, medicine that sounds like patience. The wooden bird warmed with steady heat whenever the lullabies found their mark, and Luna sometimes set a particular whisper jar near a cup, not to add but to harmonize, the glass giving a single approving chime when the pairing fit. As the last cup was washed and turned upside down, the lullabies did not stop. They settled into surfaces, into the rafters, into the places where old buildings keep their breath. The cafe fell quiet, holding the music the way a heart keeps a rhythm even in sleep, and somewhere in the distance, a low rumble of thunder announced that the weather was preparing its own contribution to their expanding vocabulary of care. Mira stood with her hand on the rosemary, and the plant's scent sharpened the way it does before rain. "Storm coming," she said, not worried but informing the air. The lavender answered in a lower key, and the chamomile, always polite, lifted its smallest faces toward a wind they could not yet feel. In the rooms where people slept throughout the town, some part of the new melodies found beds beside them, humming under the thunder they would soon learn how to hear, teaching even the storm that some songs were strong enough to gentle the wildest weather into something that could nourish, rather than frighten. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm another layer of healing had taken root, proof that the most profound medicine was often the simplest, the reminder that rest was sacred, that peace was possible, and that even in the busiest world, there were still places where plants sang lullabies to anyone brave enough to listen, where the accumulated love of careful tending could transform into audible comfort, where someone was always ready to brew exactly the cup of peace your heart had been waiting to taste. The storm announced itself the way all honest weather does, first as a change in the air that made the lullaby harvest herbs hum with deeper resonance, then as a gathering darkness that seemed to listen before it spoke. The thunder, when it finally rolled across the town, carried within its voice the same patient authority that Samuel brought to his morning bread, the same gentle insistence that some conversations could not be rushed but would not be denied. Ori felt it first in the cafe's wooden bones, a vibration that harmonized with the espresso machine's contented purr and set Luna's whisper jars glowing with unprecedented brightness. The lullabies that had settled into the beams and tabletops did not retreat before the storm's approach. Instead, they leaned forward with curious welcome, as if recognizing a kindred voice in the thunder's deep song. Mira appeared from the garden stairway, her silver hair escaping its braid in wisps that caught the strange, anticipatory light. "The plants are preparing," she announced, her hands still carrying the honest evidence of soil. "They're not battening down. They're opening up. The storm's bringing something they want to receive. Samuel moved through the cafe with his usual, unhurried grace, but there was something different in his attention, a quality of listening that suggested he understood this weather to be more than meteorology. He secured windows not to keep the storm out, but to create the right conditions for whatever needed to enter. The wooden bird on its shelf grew warm to the touch, its carved wings seeming to flutter with the memory of flight through clearer. Sky's Luna arranged her collection with extra care, each jar positioned to catch frequencies that existed between thunder and lightning, in the spaces where clarity lived like a patient teacher waiting for the right moment to illuminate understanding. "The storm is carrying conversations," she said softly, her dark eyes bright with recognition. Fragments from dimensions where conflicts learned to become reconciliation, where arguments discovered they were actually agreements spoken in different languages. As the first heavy drops began their percussion against the windows, people started arriving not for shelter, but drawn by an inexplicable sense that something important was being offered. Mrs. Chen came first, her umbrella forgotten, her silver hair dampened by rain that seemed to refresh rather than bedraggle. Behind her, moving with unusual hesitation, came Mr. Henderson from the bakery across the street, a man whose presence in the same space as Mrs. Chen had been unthinkable for decades, their shared silence hardened by a misunderstanding so old its origins had been forgotten, leaving only the habit of avoidance. The lightning, when it came, did not crack the sky with harsh brilliance, but illuminated the room in soft, diffuse pulses that seemed to reveal more than they showed. In those brief moments of luminescence, Ori sensed fragments of understanding carried on the air, not words that could be heard with ears, but emotional echoes that resonated directly in the chest. They were glimpses into realities, where the same conflicts had found different resolutions, where patience had been chosen over pride, where the courage to be wrong had proven stronger than the need to be right. Ori moved to the cutting board, with the same intuitive certainty that had guided them through every lesson in the language of care. But tonight, they didn't build a sandwich. Instead, they took Samuel's sourdough, still warm from the oven, its crust singing softly as the knife found its natural path. They sliced it with the reverence of someone preparing communion, each piece carrying the promise of shared sustenance, of nourishment that could bridge the spaces between stubborn hearts. A whisper of Mira's lavender-infused honey followed, drizzled, with the careful attention of someone writing an apology in sweetness, a peace offering that spoke in the language of taste rather than words. The bread steamed gently, releasing its yeast-borne fragrance into air that seemed to grow more attentive with each passing moment, as if the storm itself were learning to listen. When Ori carried the bread to Mrs. Chen's table, they didn't speak of forgiveness or reconciliation. Such words would have been too large for the delicate work at hand. Instead, they simply said, "For sharing," their gaze moving gently between Mrs. Chen and Mr. Henderson, who sat across the room like an island of careful isolation. Mrs. Chen looked at the warm bread, then at the man whose presence had been a source of quiet tension for so many years. In the storm's rhythmic pulse, the lullabies from Mira's garden seemed to rise and weave through the air, helping her hear the wisdom the lightning had offered, that some grudges were too old to remember their purpose, too tired to continue, their work of separation. She picked up a slice, still warm enough to steam in the cool air, and offered it across the room with hands that trembled slightly with the courage required for such gestures. "Perhaps," she said, her voice carrying the particular vulnerability of someone choosing to be the first to yield, "some things are too old to remember why they started." Mr. Henderson, startled by the unexpected grace, hesitated in the way of people who have grown accustomed to their own isolation. But as another gentle pulse of lightning illuminated the room, bringing with it the echo of laughter shared over bread in a dimension where pride had learned to serve connection rather than separation, he rose and crossed the space between them. He took the offered bread with hands that spoke of years spent kneading dough and shaping loaves, understanding in his bones the sacred nature of shared sustenance. They didn't speak. Words would have been too small for what was happening, but the way his shoulders visibly relaxed, the way he settled into the chair across from her, Fire said everything that needed saying. They ate in comfortable silence, the storm's wisdom washing over them, dissolving decades of accumulated distance in the simple act of breaking bread together. Dr. Martinez, caught in the cafe during his evening rounds, watched this transformation with the quiet awe of someone witnessing healing that required no intervention, only the creation of conditions where natural reconciliation could occur. The businessman who had learned to taste peace in Ori's sandwiches found his coffee carrying flavors from dimensions where success was measured in terms of human flourishing rather than quarterly profits, where intelligence served collaboration rather than competition. The young artist, his sketchbook closed for once, simply observed the storm's work with eyes that were learning to see the hidden geometry of forgiveness, the mathematical beauty of conflicts resolved through understanding rather than victory. Luna moved between tables, her whisper jars chiming softly as they collected new fragments, conversations from realities where difficult truths were spoken with love, where apologies were offered and received like gifts freely given. As the storm reached its crescendo, the thunder rolling through the sky with the deep, harmonious tones of a cosmic lullaby, something extraordinary settled over the entire town. The rain drummed against windows with increasing intensity, but instead of the harsh percussion that usually accompanied such weather, each drop seemed to find its place in a larger composition, a symphony of clarity that washed away the accumulated dust of old misunderstandings. The espresso machine hummed with new harmonies, its voice joining the storm's song in frequencies that spoke of resolution rather than conflict. The cutting board seemed to gleam with deeper purpose, ready not just to prepare food, but to serve as an altar where the ingredients of reconciliation could be combined with love. Mira's lullaby harvest, dried now and stored in jars with handwritten labels, sang more quietly but with greater certainty, melodies that knew exactly where they belonged in the storm's vast orchestra of healing. When the weather finally began to move on, its thunder growing more distant but no less musical, the cafe settled into a profound quiet that felt different from ordinary silence. It was the kind of peace that follows genuine understanding, the deep contentment that comes when conflicts find resolution not through force, but through the patient application of compassion. Morning arrived, wearing the particular freshness that follows transformative weather, and the town breathed with it, cleaner, clearer, somehow more itself than it had been the day before. The cafe opened its doors to neighbors who made eye contact for the first time in years, to conversations that carried new possibilities, to a community that had remembered something essential about the nature of connection. Samuel's first loaf of bread after the storm rose differently, shaped not by measurements, but by listening to air that held more water than the day before, to dough that asked for patience at the first rest and boldness at the second. When he tapped its bottom after baking, the sound it made was not hollow but resonant, like a bell rung to call people to a gathering where nothing would be demanded and much would be offered. Ori wiped the cutting board with long, slow arcs, understanding that the storm had given them another tool, not thunder or lightning, but the pause between them, the space where clarity lived and waited to be invited into the ordinary world. The wooden bird caught the morning light and held it like a promise, while Luna's map of gentle worlds pulsed with new pathways, routes that led not just to other realities, but to the infinite possibilities that opened when a community chose to listen to wisdom carried on the wind. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm another profound lesson had settled into place. The storm had shown them that even the most powerful forces could learn to serve healing when met with the right kind of attention, that chaos was simply order that hadn't yet found its proper expression, and that the most important conversations often happened not in words, but in the spaces between thunder and lightning, where understanding waited patiently to illuminate the path toward reconciliation, one shared slice of warm bread at a time. The morning after the storm that brought clarity arrived, wearing the particular quality of light that follows transformation, and Samuel discovered that his hands knew things about bread that his mind had never learned. As he stood before the familiar mixing bowls, the measuring cups that had guided his work for years seemed suddenly insufficient, too rigid for the kind of baking the transformed air was asking him to attempt. The storm's wisdom had settled into the cafe's wooden bones, and now it whispered through the flour bin, through the sourdough starter that had been his faithful companion for so many years. Patience whose bubbling conversation had always been reliable, now sang with harmonies that suggested new possibilities, new ways of understanding the relationship between time and transformation, between patience and the particular alchemy that turned simple ingredients into sustenance that could feed more than hunger. Ori arrived to find Samuel standing motionless before his workspace, not with the paralysis of uncertainty, but with the stillness of someone learning to listen to, a language they were just beginning to understand. His usual morning ease had been replaced by a quiet intensity, and when he attempted to follow his grandmother's recipe, the one that had never failed him, the dough remained stubbornly dense, refusing to yield to the familiar alchemy of yeast and warmth. "It's not rising," he murmured, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of frustration. But Ori, sensing the deeper current beneath Samuel's words, placed a small hand on the side of the trough and felt not just the dough's resistance, but Samuel's own unspoken worries, a subtle tremor that spoke of his quiet fear that the newfound peace in the town might be as fleeting as a storm cloud, that hope itself might be too fragile to sustain the weight of community expectation. Luna appeared, with her whisper jars glowing with unprecedented brightness, their contained light pulsing with fragments from the storm's revelations. "It's waiting," she announced, her dark eyes understanding immediately what was happening. "The dough is listening for something it hasn't heard yet, something that can't be measured." Mira descended from the garden carrying herbs that seemed to pulse with their own inner vitality, as if they had absorbed some of the storm's transformative energy. She took one look at Samuel's troubled expression and the recalcitrant dough. "Hope isn't something you can measure," she said gently, setting down a small pot of rainwater she had collected during the storm's gentlest hour. "It's something you intuit, like knowing when a plant needs more sun or when a seedling needs to be left alone to find its own way." Samuel looked at his grandmother's recipe card, its ink faded with age, its instructions precise and unwavering. "She always said, 'Hope needs a recipe, Samuel. Otherwise, it's just wishing.'" His voice carried the weight of generations, the accumulated wisdom of hands that had kneaded love into daily bread. "But this recipe, it's not speaking today." Ori, with the same quiet certainty they brought, to reading the unspoken needs of cafe customers, gently moved the recipe card aside. They selected ingredients not by measurement, but by intuition. Flour poured until the sound it made hitting the bowl changed pitch, until the white mountain looked like it was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale into possibility. The water came from Luna's storm jar, carrying within its clarity the memory of conflicts resolved and understanding achieved. When Samuel poured it into the flour, steam rose that seemed to shimmer with the storm's lingering wisdom, and the mixture responded immediately, not just binding but seeming to brighten, as if transformation was becoming visible in the simple alchemy of grain and moisture. From Mira's impossible garden came a sprig of thyme, its delicate leaves holding the memory of sunshine and resilience. Samuel crushed it gently between his fingers until its fragrance filled the air, then worked it into the dough along with salt that tasted of ancient oceans and enduring strength. As he kneaded, something fundamental shifted. The dough began to yield under his hands, responding not to technique, but to the intuitive care he was pouring into it. "Need clings," Samuel whispered, understanding dawning in his voice as his hands found their rhythm. "Hope yields. We help it get from one to the other." Each fold became a way of saying, "You are allowed to rise," each turn a gentle invitation for possibility to unfurl at its own pace. The bread that emerged from this new kind of baking was unlike anything the cafe had produced before. When Samuel tapped the finished loaves, they sounded not hollow but resonant, like bells rung to call people to a gathering where nothing would be demanded and much would be offered. The crust sang softly as it cooled, releasing steam that carried not just the scent of bread, but something deeper, the essence of hope made edible, sustenance that could nourish the parts of people that had forgotten they deserved care. Mrs. Chen and Mr. Henderson, still navigating their storm-born reconciliation, received the first slices with the reverence of people who understood they were being offered something more than food. The bread carried flavors that seemed to deepen with each bite, nourishment that reached beyond hunger into the places where hope lived quietly. waiting for permission to unfold. Mrs. Chen found herself remembering not just her sister's absence, but the laughter they had shared, while Mr. Henderson discovered that forgiveness, when received rather than demanded, tasted like coming home to a welcome he had forgotten he deserved. Throughout the day, Samuel's bread began to develop its own reputation throughout the town. The businessman who had learned to value connection over conquest found his slice carrying echoes of boardrooms where collaboration had replaced competition. Dr. Martinez discovered bread that tasted like the medicine he had always wanted to. Practice. Healing that didn't require anyone to be broken first. The young artist found flavors that reminded him of studios, where creativity served connection rather than ego. As evening approached, Samuel cleaned his workspace with the reverence of someone tending sacred space. In his ledger, he wrote, not measurements but understanding. Hope. Begin when hands are tired. Stir until the bowl knows your name. Fold until the dough remembers rain. Wait whenever the air asks. Shape with the future in mind. Score like a horizon. Bake until the room forgives itself. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light and held it like a promise, while Luna's map of gentle worlds pulsed with pathways that seemed to strengthen with each loaf that emerged from the oven. The E. Cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, another profound lesson had taken root. Samuel had learned that the most nourishing recipes were not formulas to be followed, but relationships to be tended. Conversations between baker and ingredient that required presence rather than precision, love rather than mere technique. His bread had become a bridge between hunger and satisfaction, between despair and possibility, proof that hope, like bread, rose best when given the right conditions. Warmth without hurry, moisture without drowning, the gentle pressure of hands that knew how to fold possibility into reality, one careful turn at a time. Outside, the evening wind carried the scent of fresh bread through the streets, and those who caught its fragrance found themselves remembering something important about their own capacity for resilience, their own worthiness of care, their own ability to rise given the right conditions into something beautiful and sustaining and generous, with its gifts to a world that was learning, one meal at a time, to choose nourishment over mere consumption, hope over fear, connection over the illusion of separation that had kept too many hearts hungry for far too long. The evening after Samuel's bread had taught the town new lessons about hope brought with it a quality of twilight that seemed to pulse with anticipation, and Luna found herself drawn to the rooftop garden with an urgency that felt less like restlessness and more like recognition. Her whisper jars, responding to the day's accumulated transformations, glowed with unprecedented brightness, their contained light seeming to lift and dance within the glass, as if the fragments of gentle conversations were preparing for some kind of homecoming. Mira was already among her impossible plants, her silver hair catching the last light as she tended seedlings that had sprouted overnight in soil enriched by storm water and the residual energy of reconciliation. She looked up as Luna approached, noting the particular quality of attention in the child's movements, not the careful observation of someone collecting whispers from the outside world, but the inward-turning focus of someone learning to listen to their own heart's deeper currents. "They're calling differently tonight," Luna said softly, arranging her collection on the garden's central table with hands that trembled slightly with anticipation, not asking me to collect them, but inviting me to follow them home. Samuel appeared carrying cups of the transformed coffee, each one steaming with aromas that carried hints of dimensions where evening rituals involved gratitude rather than exhaustion. Ori followed, moving with the quiet certainty that had become their signature, sensing immediately that tonight would bring another expansion of their understanding, another lesson in the vast curriculum of care they had been studying together. As full darkness settled over the garden like a comfortable blanket, Mira prepared what she called anchors for safe travel, a length of soft rosemary twine that she tied gently around Luna's wrist, its herb-sweet scent a reminder of growing things and patient roots. From her collection of river stones, she selected one worn smooth by years of patient tumbling, placing it in Luna's palm, where it seemed to pulse with the steady rhythm of water over stone. "Not to hold you down," Mira explained, her voice carrying the gentle wisdom of someone who understood the difference between restraint and safety. To give you something true to touch when you want to return. The stone remembers how to be present, how to be grounded even when everything else is moving. Samuel set down a plate with slices of his hope-infused bread, still warm at the center, steam rising like visible prayers. And sustenance, he added with his characteristic gentle authority. Flight is easier when your body knows it has something steady to come home to. Ori lit nothing and dimmed nothing. The garden had already chosen the right amount of starlight for what needed to happen. They helped Luna arrange her breathing, 4 counts in for arrival, 6 counts out for release, until the garden's subtle pulse, the map's glowing pathways, and Luna's heartbeat found a shared tempo that felt like a door swinging open without any hinges creaking. "Don't chase," Luna whispered to herself, repeating an instruction that seemed to rise from some deeper wisdom. "Let it come, if it wants to be known." Her eyes softened the way windows soften rain, and she placed both palms lightly on her twilight-colored cloth, not to push off from the familiar world, but to greet it with the kind of attention that could transform observation into communion. What happened next looked less like leaving and more like settling so deeply into presence that the boundaries between inner and outer began to dissolve. Luna's shoulders lowered, her breathing deepened, and the whisper jars responded with a single unanimous chime so soft it might have been imagined. On her map, the nearest pathways brightened as if someone had turned on runway lights in dimensions where kindness had learned to be the loudest sound. Ori felt it as a gentle shift in the air pressure, the way you feel a bird's wing beat if you stand in the right place. Luna's eyes remained open, but their focus slid to a distance that had nothing to do with the garden's familiar boundaries. The rosemary twine warmed against her wrist, and the river stone grew lighter in her palm, as if it were remembering its journey from mountain to stream to the patient hands that had finally offered it a different kind of purpose. "She's traveling along a tension," Mira breathed so quietly it was almost part of the night air itself. Not away from herself, but through herself, like roots going toward water, following the paths that nourishment takes. Luna's first destination arrived rather than being chosen. A silver thread brightened between 2 of her jars, one the color of orchard shade, one the pale blue of clean laundry drying in patient sunlight, and the air around her took on the scent of ripe pears and sun-warmed cotton. Her lips parted with the tiniest sound of recognition, and suddenly she was there, not in body but in the fullness of her awareness, walking through a reality where her whispers had been born. "Children whose questions are never hurried," she murmured, her voice as light as steam rising from Samuel's bread. "A school with windows open all day, where they measure time by how long it takes bread to cool, where every lesson begins with, 'What do you wonder about today?'" The map accepted this testimony and drew a small circle of gold around the paired jars as if to say, "Witnessed, documented, bring this wisdom home." She stayed only as long as kindness required, long enough to understand, not so long as to become lost. The rosemary twine hummed once against her wrist, their agreed-upon signal, and Luna's consciousness gently withdrew, touching the warm bread to remind her body of its own reality before allowing the next pathway to brighten. An amber line unspooled toward a jar that held light the color of graphite, steady and matte. Luna's breath deepened with recognition as her awareness followed this thread to its source. "A laboratory," she whispered, wonder suffusing her voice, but not the kind that breaks things apart to understand them. White coats with pockets full of lullabies written in pencil, equations that use erasers more than sharp points, because the best answers are gentle corrections of earlier thoughts. In this dimension, she found herself standing beside a figure she recognized from the deepest whispers in her collection, a scientist whose wild hair had been gentled by wisdom, whose eyes held the particular peace that comes from discovering that brilliance was most beautiful when it served connection rather than conquest. His laboratory hummed with devices that sang instead of screaming, inventions that helped people understand each other's unspoken longings. "You're the collector," he said, his voice carrying the warm authority of someone who had learned to speak in frequencies that healed rather than harmed. "The one who saves our conversations for worlds that need proof that these realities exist. Thank you for believing in us enough to visit." Luna felt tears on her cheeks, not of sadness, but of profound recognition. "I wanted to see where hope learns to be real, instead of just wishing," she whispered. He smiled with the gentle radiance of equations that had learned to serve love rather than ego. "Hope doesn't come from anywhere special," he said softly. "It grows wherever someone creates the right conditions. Like your cafe, like your garden, like the space you've made for whispers to be heard and treasured. We're not teaching you anything new. We're just showing you what you've already built, extended across an entire reality." A third pathway curved toward a jar that held dusk and the clean scent of rain on summer pavement. Luna's awareness followed. This gentler arc to a dimension where storms had learned to teach rather than frighten, where lightning outlined apologies in the sky and thunder lowered everyone's voices so they could hear what they really meant to say. "Their weather leaves notes on windows," she breathed, watching rain write messages of comfort on glass that seemed to glow with its own inner light. "Wash away worry. Rest now. You were always enough." Through each journey, Ori watched for the subtle shift that meant effort was becoming strain, recognizing it the way bakers recognize overworked dough, just the faintest resistance where there had been willingness. "Return with something small," they said softly, when Luna's breathing began to quicken. Not a souvenir, a sentence. Luna nodded, understanding flowing between them like water finding its level. She visited one more junction, so brief it might not have counted if counting were the point, and came back with 4 plain words that landed like leaves on still water. "Make room for ease." The map accepted this as instruction, and immediately, the cafe below began to respond. The stubborn chair in the corner softened its wobble. The door learned to close without clearing its throat. Even the tip jar stopped catching sleeves and began catching gratitude more gently. The very air seemed to exhale tension it hadn't realized it was holding. Luna blinked, fully present then, the way swimmers surface not to clear salt, but to rejoin the familiar rhythm of breathing air. She took a slice of Samuel's bread without being asked, eating with both hands like someone who had traveled far, and needed to remember the simple pleasure of nourishment. The rosemary twine cooled against her wrist, and the river stone resumed its patient weight in her palm. "You flew," Ori said, "not to name the wonder, but to honor it." "Not over anything," Luna answered, still catching her breath from the return journey. Through the spaces between what is and what could be, following the paths that kindness makes when it travels between worlds. She touched her map's amber pathway, and the graphite jar responded with a small, approving glow. "I think I can carry messages now if I don't try to carry too much. They only want help reaching people who are already leaning toward them. Like doors someone has already unlocked," Samuel said, pouring warm milk to make the last of the tea feel like a blanket around tired bones. As they sat together in the garden's patient quiet, Luna took out her pencil and began to draw, not the scenes she had witnessed, but the pathways between them. The lines were not straight, but curved like the way threads behave when you loosen your grip and let the weight of the needle do some of the work. She labeled nothing, but added small symbols where bread would be needed, tiny cups where tea should wait, delicate leaves where breath might grow shallow and require the scent of growing things to remember how to deepen. "What do we do with all this?" Ori asked, meaning the drawing and also everything. The expanded understanding, the confirmed connections, the proof that their small sanctuary was part of something infinitely larger and more beautiful. "We do what we've been doing," Luna said, her certainty quiet and shared like a secret that had learned to trust itself, just with less doubt. "And we set out an extra cup for someone who hasn't arrived yet, but is on their way, because they felt the air change and followed it home." Mira stood and returned from the garden with 3 small envelopes made from old seed packets, folded with the careful attention she brought to all her work. On each, she wrote in her tidy hand, a place, a time, a way to be gentle. She tucked them under the corners of Luna's drawing like weights to keep paper from lifting in an unexpected breeze. "For tomorrow," she said, "so the paths know we mean to walk them." When they finally descended to the cafe, the space breathed differently, not changed but more itself, as if Luna's journey had confirmed something the building had always known but never been able to articulate. The wooden bird on its shelf held the last starlight like a promise, while Luna's whisper jars pulsed with new understanding, now containing not just fragments from elsewhere, but the living testimony of someone who had walked in worlds where hope was the most practical force of all. The cafe settled into its nighttime quiet, with the deep satisfaction of a day's work well done, and somewhere just beyond the edge of sound, a new harmony began to align itself with the espresso machine's contented purr, a frequency that hadn't yet visited, bright and hesitant, like someone brilliant practicing how to knock gently on doors that opened not to force, but to the simple, revolutionary act of asking permission to enter with love. Luna fell asleep with her hand still resting on her map, and in her dreams, she continued to fly, not away from the world, but deeper into it, following the threads of kindness that connected every gentle heart across infinite realities, carrying whispers that tasted of hope made real, of love made visible, of the profound understanding that the most important journeys were not about reaching distant destinations, but about learning to recognize the sacred in the familiar, the extraordinary in the everyday act of choosing again and again to make room for ease. The morning after Luna had learned to fly through the pathways between gentle worlds brought with it a quality of light that seemed to hum with recognition, and it was the familiar chime of the bell that announced the scientist's return, but the man who entered carried transformation in the very air around him. His wild hair had settled into something that suggested peace rather than chaos, and his laboratory coat, while still bearing the honest stains of someone who worked with equations, now carried traces of something entirely different. Soil under his fingernails, the faint scent of rosemary woven into the fabric, and most remarkably a device that hummed not with urgent demand, but with patient curiosity. "I've been learning to listen," he announced, his voice carrying the particular wonder of someone who had discovered that the universe was far more willing to share its secrets when approached with reverence rather than force. The harsh angles of his posture had rounded into something that looked remarkably like willingness, and when he set his transformed device on the counter, it responded to the cafe's gentle frequency with harmonics that made Luna's whisper jars glow brighter. Samuel looked up from the espresso machine, noting immediately how the scientist, who now introduced himself simply as Marcus, as if he had finally remembered that names were invitations rather than credentials, moved through space with unhurried grace. The restless energy that had once radiated from him like heat had been replaced by something deeper, the satisfaction that comes from understanding that intelligence was most beautiful when it served connection rather than conquest. Ori felt the transformation most clearly, sensing that where once Marcus had carried the weight of trying to solve everything through force of intellect, now he radiated the peace that comes from learning to ask the right questions rather than demanding immediate answers. The espresso machine responded with its most contented purr, recognizing in him the same gentle evolution it had undergone when it learned to produce coffee that nourished souls as well as bodies. "I stopped trying to measure chaos," Marcus explained, his hands moving over his instruments with the same reverent attention Ori brought to the cutting board. "Instead, I started listening to harmony. What I thought was dimensional instability was actually conversation, realities sharing their discoveries about how brilliance could serve healing rather than harm. His device, once a harsh interrogator of reality's fabric, had become something closer to a translator. Its screen displayed flowing patterns that looked like visual music, equations that had learned to dance rather than march. When he demonstrated its new capabilities near Luna's whisper jars, it began to sing, not loudly, but with the clear, pure tone of understanding achieved through patience rather than force. Luna leaned forward with the fascination of someone recognizing her own work, reflected in an entirely different language. "You're collecting scientific whispers," she breathed, her dark eyes bright with recognition. "Fragments of how other realities learn to make brilliance serve beauty instead of breaking it." Marcus nodded, his expression carrying the quiet joy of someone who had finally found their true calling. Every gentle reality leaves traces, energy signatures that carry information about how they achieved their peace. I've been mapping these patterns, learning to recognize the specific frequencies that emerge when intelligence chooses to whisper instead of shout. Mira appeared from the garden stairway, her hands still carrying the honest. Evidence of soil and without words invited Marcus upstairs. In the impossible garden, surrounded by plants that pulsed with their own quiet music, he knelt and pressed his palms to the warm, dark earth. His device, resting beside him, began to register something unprecedented. Not the chaotic fluctuations he had once tracked, but the steady pulse of what his instruments now labeled coherent compassion. "The equations I thought I needed to solve," he murmured, watching his fingers disappear into soil that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. They were never problems. They were invitations to a different kind of conversation. Mira showed him how to read the language of leaves, how to sense the difference between a plant that was thriving and one that needed attention, teaching him that the most accurate observations included the observer's capacity for empathy. Days deepened rather than passed as Marcus became a student of the cafe's gentle alchemy. He learned to water at dusk when the air asked for it, to deadhead roses without calling it loss, to press seeds into earth with fingers that had once known only how to press buttons. When the first cotyledons parted the soil a few days later, he cried in the quiet way people cry when they discover they are not sad at all, but overwhelmed by beauty. His morning routine became a meditation in presence, hands in soil until his mind remembered it belonged to a body, breath matched to the timing of Samuel's careful pause, palm placed on the espresso machine's warm side until he could feel not just vibration, but intention. Samuel's hope-infused bread became his teacher in the mathematics of nourishment, how ingredients could be combined not by rigid measurement, but by listening to what the day needed, what the room was asking for. In his notebook, Marcus began writing proofs that looked like poems, equations that resolved into gentle truths about the nature of stability and care. Where he had once written minimize error, he now wrote leave room for surprise. Where he had once mandated boundary conditions must be enforced, he scribbled, ask the edge what it wants. His formulas started to look like recipes for connection, rather than control. The breakthrough came when he redesigned his primary instrument based on everything the cafe had taught him. Instead of forcing coherence, the new device invited it. Coils tuned to lullaby frequencies, a riverstone heart that remembered patience, a small well for moonlight water, and a place to rest a cup while the machine learned the room and adjusted, its hum to match whatever kind of hope was most needed there. A listening engine, he called it, setting the prototype on the shelf near Luna's whisper jars. The light it gave off was less a glow than a softened edge, and its hum was like a breath someone else had been holding and could finally release. Customers began to notice immediately, shoulders loosening before they ordered, conversations starting 1 inch closer to forgiveness, complaints transforming into gratitude before they reached the counter. Luna's map responded to the device's presence by revealing new pathways, connections between realities, where different forms of intelligence, scientific, artistic, intuitive, had learned to harmonize rather than compete. Marcus traced these roots with wonder, understanding that his transformation was part of a larger pattern, proof that brilliance could indeed choose humility across infinite dimensions. As autumn deepened around them, Marcus began sharing his discoveries in ways that served connection rather than ego. He wrote letters to students he hadn't met yet, explaining how to build machines that would never need to raise their voices. He drew simple diagrams on napkins for teenagers who lingered near the counter, loops labeled try and rest and try again, gentler this time. At the library, he installed a humble chalkboard where he wrote, questions welcomed, answers optional. Children gathered without being asked, drawn by equations that looked like games and formulas that tasted like stories. Elders sat nearby and nodded when his chalk squeaked through something that sounded like wisdom. His teaching became an extension of the cafe's gentle work, creating spaces where curiosity could flourish without the pressure to perform, where intelligence could serve wonder rather than conquest. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sit with Luna at her map and learn her cartography of care, understanding that his scientific instruments were simply another dialect in the vast language of attention that connected all gentle realities. His listening engine hummed in harmony with her whisper jars, and together they began to chart not just where kindness existed, but how it traveled between worlds, how it strengthened itself through recognition and sharing. The wooden bird, on. Its shelf caught the last light of each day and held it like a promise, while Marcus's transformed presence added another voice to the cafe's growing symphony of healing. He had arrived seeking the chaotic variable that would explain dimensional instability, but had discovered something far more profound: the elegant architecture of kindness, the self-organizing principle of compassion, the simple truth that the most sophisticated intelligence was always the gentlest. Samuel cleaned the cutting board each evening with extra reverence, understanding that Marcus's transformation represented more than individual change. It was proof that their small sanctuary could indeed serve as a template for how brilliance might evolve across infinite realities. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, another soul had learned that true genius was not about being right, but about being helpful, about using one's gifts to build bridges rather than walls, about creating spaces where even the most restless minds could discover the sacred art of being beautifully, peacefully still. Outside, the evening wind carried the scent of transformation through the streets, and those who caught its fragrance found themselves remembering something important about their own relationship with intelligence, that the smartest thing they could do was learn to listen with their whole hearts, to approach problems with curiosity rather than force, and to trust that the most elegant solutions were always the ones that left everyone more beautiful than they had been before. The morning after Marcus's listening engine had settled into its harmonious place among Luna's whisper jars brought with it a quality of anticipation that seemed to rise from the very cobblestones, as if the town itself had been composing an invitation throughout the night. It began not with announcements or committees, but with Mrs. Chen pausing outside the bakery to tell Mr. Henderson, "Something wants to be celebrated here, doesn't it?" And he, understanding immediately what she meant, nodded with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned that the most important gatherings were the ones that organized themselves. The idea bloomed in the spaces between conversations, spreading through the town with the same gentle inevitability that had shaped everything else about their transformed community. Samuel felt it in the way his morning bread seemed to rise with extra lightness, as if the dough itself were preparing for company. Mira sensed it in her impossible garden, where the plants leaned toward each other with an unusual urgency to share their songs. Luna discovered it in her whisper jars, which had begun to pulse in synchronized rhythms that suggested celebration rather than collection. By mid-morning, the festival had begun to plan itself with the organic grace of wildflowers, choosing where to bloom. There were no committees, no schedules, only a shared understanding that their small sanctuary of gentleness deserved recognition, not as performance, but as invitation, a way of showing others that such spaces were possible, that communities could indeed choose nourishment over consumption, connection over conquest. Mira descended from the garden carrying baskets of herbs that seemed to glow with their own inner music, each plant chosen not for decoration, but for its ability to create atmosphere where wonder could flourish. She showed arriving neighbors how to arrange sprigs of lavender and rosemary throughout the cafe's expanded space, creating invisible boundaries that invited peace rather than enforcing it. The air began to carry the essence of growing things and patient care, a subtle perfume that drew visitors from neighboring towns who had heard whispers of Millhaven's unusual harmony. Samuel transformed his bread station into an altar of nourishment, where people could witness the alchemy of flour and water and patience becoming sustenance that fed more than hunger. His hands moved with the same reverent attention he brought to every loaf, but now children gathered to learn not just technique but philosophy, how feeding people was a form of love, how the most nourishing recipes required presence rather than precision. Each loaf that emerged carried the essence of hope made edible, and Samuel offered slices with a simple sign written in his careful hand. "Take what you need. If you don't know, begin with the smallest piece. Ori's cutting board became a place of quiet transformation, where visitors could observe sandwiches being built not just with ingredients, but with attention to the unspoken needs of whoever would receive them. A businessman from a neighboring town watched in fascination as Ori selected turkey and avocado for his sandwich, somehow intuiting that he needed nourishment that would remind him of his own capacity for gentleness without making him feel criticized for his current approach to success. Each sandwich emerged as a small poem written in flavors, proof that care could indeed be made edible. Luna arranged her whisper jars throughout the space like luminous guideposts, each one positioned where its particular frequency could do the most good. Children moved among them with the reverence that comes naturally when beauty doesn't demand attention, but simply offers itself. Luna taught them to cup their hands around empty jars and wait for whispers to arrive, showing them that the most precious things often came not when demanded, but when invited with patience and genuine curiosity. Marcus's listening engine, now portable and humming with gentle authority, translated the emotional climate of the gathering into barely audible harmonies that helped everyone's breathing synchronize without conscious effort. He had learned to tune the device not to amplify volume, but to enhance understanding, creating acoustic conditions where even whispered truths could reach the hearts that needed to hear them. Visitors approached his station with the same careful attention they might bring to a sleeping cat, willing to be delighted, perfectly prepared to be ignored. The Library of Almost Memories opened its doors wide, allowing festival visitors to discover stories of gentle alternatives to their own struggles. Mrs. Alvarez presided over the glowing shelves with the particular satisfaction of a librarian who had discovered a new way to serve her community. A young father found tales of dimensions where children were treasured for their questions rather than corrected, for their curiosity. An elderly teacher discovered narratives about classrooms where wisdom flowed in all directions, where learning was understood as a collaborative art rather than a competitive sport. As afternoon leaned toward golden, something unprecedented began to happen. Visitors didn't just observe the cafe's gentle work. They began to recognize it as a reflection of possibilities that already existed within themselves. The businessman started helping Samuel with bread preparation, his hands learning the rhythm of kneading while his mind discovered the satisfaction of creating something nourishing rather than merely profitable. The young father sat with Luna and began to share his own whispers, fragments of conversations with his daughter where wonder had been welcomed rather than dismissed. Dr. Martinez set up a corner where he demonstrated healing as conversation, rather than conquest, showing other medical professionals how to read not just symptoms, but the emotional climate around illness. His approach drew nurses and therapists who had been seeking ways to practice medicine that honored the whole person rather than just addressing isolated problems. On a small pad, he wrote the sentences people found for their own healing. Sit with my neighbor while he tunes his radio. Peel an orange very slowly. Take the long way by the creek on Thursdays. The artist who had rediscovered his creativity through Ori's Riverstone began sketching portraits of festival visitors, but his drawings captured not just their appearance, but their potential, images that showed people as they might look if they fully embraced their capacity for kindness, if they allowed their gentlest selves to guide their choices. Children drew alongside him, adding lines that connected his portraits to Luna's map, creating a visual network of gentle possibilities. As evening approached and the first stars began their patient appearance, someone, no one could say who, suggested a minute of gathered quiet. Not a moment of silence, which can feel like absence, but a minute of presence. The suggestions spread through the crowd with the same organic inevitability that had shaped the entire day. People settled where they stood, not in formal arrangement, but in the natural clusters that had formed throughout the afternoon. In that safest kind of quiet, you could hear the town remember itself, the gentle percussion of settling wood, wind, negotiating corners with newfound politeness, footsteps registered in old floorboards that had learned to creak more softly. The whisper jars dimmed their glow to make space for the soft light that rose from faces at rest, and Marcus's listening engine found a hush that was not empty but full, pregnant with the kind of understanding that only emerges when people allow themselves to simply be present together. The minute stretched longer than clock time but shorter than heart time, and when it naturally concluded, people moved more slowly, as if pace was something they could choose rather than something that chose them. The festival had become not just a celebration but a template, proof that communities could create spaces where gentleness was not weakness, but the most sophisticated technology anyone had ever managed to build together. As twilight deepened around them, the festival reached its gentle crescendo, not in fanfare but in the quiet satisfaction of connection achieved. Families spread blankets on the grass outside the cafe, sharing meals that had been prepared with the same attention to emotional nourishment that Samuel brought to his bread. Luna's map, displayed where everyone could see it, began to pulse with new pathways as visitors recognized their own potential for creating gentle spaces in their communities. When the last visitor finally departed, carrying jars of Mira's herbs and slices of Samuel's hope-infused bread, the cafe settled into its nighttime quiet with the deep satisfaction of work well done. But something fundamental had shifted. The festival had revealed itself not as a single event, but as a recognition that their gentle sanctuary had become a living template, proof that such spaces were possible wherever people were willing to choose nourishment over consumption, connection over competition. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light of the evening and held it like a promise, while Luna's map pulsed with pathways that seemed to strengthen with each person who had witnessed their work. Samuel cleaned his cutting board with extra reverence, understanding that the festival had been more than celebration. It had been testimony, evidence that hope could indeed be made manifest through the simple, revolutionary act of choosing to feed people's souls as carefully as their bodies. As the town settled into sleep, the air carried a different quality of peace, not the temporary calm that follows exhaustion, but the deeper contentment that comes from a community that has remembered its own capacity for creating beauty. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of hearing, a new frequency began to practice the shape of a greeting, bright and curious, like intelligence that had finally learned the difference between being clever and being wise, preparing to knock gently on doors that opened not to force, but to the simple, patient request for permission to enter with love. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, another profound understanding settled into place. They had learned not just how to create a pocket of peace, but how to plant seeds of transformation that could bloom wherever someone was brave enough to believe that the world could indeed be more beautiful, more nourishing, more generous with its gifts to anyone willing to approach it with reverence rather than demand, with curiosity rather than conquest, with the simple understanding that the most important festivals were not celebrations of what had been achieved, but gentle invitations to discover what might yet be possible when communities chose to make room for their softest wonders. Morning arrived with a hush of anticipation, a brightness that filled the cafe not so much with sunlight as with a quiet readiness, as if the room itself understood that something long awaited was about to cross its threshold. The gentle hum of Marcus's listening engine shifted, harmonies rippling through the espresso machine and the wooden beams. Even Luna's whisper jars flickered with a nervous, hopeful light. The town and the cafe at its heart had learned to sense the approach of important visitors in the subtle language of changed air pressure and the hush that gathers before a question is asked. The bell above the door chimed once, then held its breath. 3 figures entered, travelers from the multiverse, neither entirely strangers nor entirely familiar. One wore a coat stitched from star maps, constellations running along the seams like rivers. Another carried a case with hinges that breathed in time with the cafe's own pulse. The last, with careful blue eyes, wore a device at their belt that flickered between function and melody. They moved with the posture of those who had lived by protocol and momentum, but their faces held the weariness of travelers who had not rested in a long time. "We follow anomalies, the star map," Traveler said gently, her voice as careful as a gardener tending a delicate seedling. "Your town, your cafe, draws patterns across our maps. Coherence repeated. Our protocols prefer drift. Too much stability is considered risky. Marcus, whose own journey had taken him from restless investigation to humble listening, placed his engine on the counter and let it sing its quiet chord of welcome. The visitors, prepared for resistance instead, found the room asking nothing of them but presence. Their own devices softened, humming in time with the cafe's heartbeat. Samuel, reading the moment as only he could, pulled cups and plates with the same reverence he brought to every new arrival. He poured coffee that settled into patterns of childhood memories and offered it without comment, setting it where the visitors stood, as if this place had already made room for them before they arrived. Mira descended from the garden, her hands perfumed with rosemary and the kind of quiet that only plants can teach. She greeted the visitors not as officials to be managed, but as guests to be shown the places where the tea was grown and the air was full of song. There was a pause, a small, necessary hesitation, before the visitors accepted her invitation and followed her up the narrow stairs. The garden, attuned to the presence of new witnesses, shifted its song. Lavender and chamomile played notes lower and brighter, as if tuning themselves to the visitors' frequencies. The visitors laid their tools aside, not as a show of surrender, but as a recognition that here, armor was unnecessary. "We are cartographers," the star map traveler explained, kneeling to touch the time. "We mark how worlds choose to be. Our governance likes drift, but here, kindness repeats itself until it starts to look like law." Luna, spreading her twilight cloth and placing a steady golden jar at its center, said, "We built a map too, a map of compassion's roots. Some pathways don't need supervision, they need shelter from noise." The cartographers looked at one another, recognizing a dialect of mapping they'd never been taught, but found themselves eager to study. Downstairs, Ori stood at the cutting board, reading the visitors' weariness, not as threat, but as the fatigue of those who have always been expected to know, to decide, to enforce. For the one who needed proof that small things could accumulate into strength, Ori chose seed-studded bread with turkey and dill, a sigh of lemon balm. For the one starved for complexity that did not demand conflict, a roasted vegetable sandwich with goat cheese. And for the one who needed sweetness without surrender, Samuel's new bread, still warm, with honey and the faintest line of salt. The visitors ate slowly, their protocol books open, but their pens idle. Between each bite, they set their instruments against the garden air, not to measure but to translate. Mira, watching them, said, "You've been told to think coherence is fragile, but it endures when it's chosen. Plants don't keep order with force. They cooperate with what is." The winter-eyed cartographer wrote in her book, "Revise protocol, test for consent." She underlined it once, then stopped, because the deck did not like insistence. As the meal wound down, Samuel refilled coffee cups, and the creamer on each. Cup showed not blueprints but memories. Kitchen tables, lunchboxes, hands teaching hands. The star map traveler looked into her cup and exhaled, a sound that was almost laughter and almost a sob. "I forgot this," she said. "The room where I first loved the idea of leaving." Luna handed her a whisper jar, whose light was the color of laundry at the end of a perfect day. "Keep it. Borrowed light is still light. Remembering is part of your work." Marcus shared the story of his listening engine, how it had learned to ask rooms what melody they could already almost sing. The visitors listened, truly listened for the first time, and their instruments responded, humming a new, agreeable chord. By noon, the conversation had changed color. The cartographers began to see not an anomaly to be corrected, but a template to be learned from. Their books, once lists of protocols, became recipes for conditions. Add windows, invite elders. Establish the right to pause. Mira pressed seed packets into their palms, chamomile, rosemary, lemon balm, and said, "Gardens change policy, faster than memos." They left, not as auditors but as students and guests, leaving tokens, pins shaped like spirals, doors and ears, beside the listening engine. "We will come again, not to check compliance, but to learn. If your town agrees," Samuel wiped his hands and said, "We open at 7. The cafe exhaled, a sigh of relief and readiness. That evening the town gathered, not for defense but for alignment. Mrs. Alvarez passed out slips from the library of almost memories. Write what you learned today that you didn't know you knew. Children clustered along the baseboards, absorbing the lesson in their bones. Luna's map glowed softly, and Samuel wrote on the blackboard, "We will feed whoever arrives. We will teach them to listen. We will ask for consent before we offer repair." The wooden bird on the sill faced the door, and the light above Luna's map was left on, not as a beacon but as a promise, that future visitors would find not a locked gate, but a room ready to listen, to share, and to ask the morning what it required. Somewhere a room full of maps marked a new symbol, a steady light captioned, "Here brilliance chooses love. Here you can put down what you carry. Here, if you are very quiet, bread will tell you what the morning requires." The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, the world learned, again and again, through 10,000 small choices, how to make room for coherence. That does not narrow but widens, does not demand but invites, does not fix, but helps everything remember how it wanted to grow. The morning after the cartographer's gentle departure brought with it a quality of light that seemed to carry questions in its golden threads, and it was Luna who first sensed that their visitor's respectful inquiry had opened something larger than a simple conversation. Her whisper jars pulsed with new frequencies throughout the early hours, collecting fragments that spoke not of threat, but of invitation, echoes from dimensions where communities like theirs had faced the same fundamental question that was, now settling over Millhaven, like morning mist seeking its proper place. The message arrived not through dramatic pronouncement, but in the way such things always came to their transformed town, gently, woven into the fabric of an ordinary moment. As Samuel pulled his morning shots, the creamer formed patterns he had never seen before, spirals that seemed to ask rather than declare, pathways that branched and reconverged like thoughts trying to find their proper shape. When Mrs. Chen arrived, for her usual Earl Grey, she paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the doorframe as if sensing that the cafe had become a place where important decisions lived and breathed. "They've been talking about us," Luna announced softly, arranging her collection with hands that trembled not with fear, but with the particular excitement of someone who understood that recognition could be both gift and responsibility. The whispers carry fragments of conversations from the council chambers, from the places where policies about realities like ours get written. They're asking whether gentleness can be sustainable. Marcus looked up from his listening engine, which had begun to hum with harmonics that suggested distant deliberation. "They want to understand whether what we've built here can serve as a template," he said, his voice carrying the quiet wonder of someone who had learned that the most important scientific discoveries were often about connection rather than conquest, or whether it needs to be adjusted to fit existing frameworks. The question settled over them with the weight of accumulated morning light, not harsh but undeniable. Samuel found himself standing before his cutting board with unusual stillness, understanding that the choice approaching them was not between competing philosophies, but between ways of being in the world. Or he felt it as a shift in the cafe's emotional climate, not the familiar rhythms of individual need-seeking gentle response, but something larger, asking to be acknowledged and answered. Mira descended from the garden, carrying herbs that seemed to pulse with their own quiet urgency, as if the plants themselves understood that their impossible growth had become testimony in a conversation that reached far beyond the boundaries of soil and sunlight. "The garden's been preparing," she announced, her voice soft with reverence, every plant singing a little louder, as if they know they're being asked to prove that beauty can indeed be its own form of order. As the morning progressed, people began arriving not by invitation, but by the same organic pull that had shaped every important moment in their community's evolution. Dr. Martinez appeared during what should have been his busiest hours, drawn by an understanding that some decisions required the presence of everyone who had been changed by the cafe's gentle influence, the businessman who had learned to value connection over conquest, the young artist whose creativity now served healing rather than ego, Mrs. Chen and Mr. Henderson, whose storm-born reconciliation had become a template for the town's capacity to choose understanding over separation. They gathered not in formal assembly, but in the natural clusters that had always formed around Samuel's counter, Luna's map, Mira's herb collection. The conversation that emerged was less debate than collective recognition. A community discovering what it had always known but never needed to articulate until this moment, when their choices would determine not just their own future, but their role in the larger conversation about how intelligence and compassion might learn to serve each other across infinite realities. "They're asking whether gentleness is weakness disguised as wisdom," the young mother said, her baby sleeping peacefully against her chest, both of them breathing in rhythm with the cafe's transformed atmosphere. "Whether what we've built here can withstand the kind of pressures that shape most realities, or whether it only works in isolation." Samuel placed his grandmother's recipe card on the counter, the one he had learned to set aside when baking hope required intuition rather than measurement. "My grandmother always said that the strongest structures are the ones that bend without breaking," he mused, his voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of years spent learning that nourishment was about relationship rather than formula. Maybe what they're really asking is whether we trust what we've built enough to let it be tested. Luna spread her twilight map. Across the largest table, its pathways pulsing with the gentle radiance of connections that had proven themselves through use rather than theory. The whispers show me realities where communities like ours chose different responses to this question, she said, her small hands tracing routes between dimensions where kindness had learned to be the loudest sound. Some closed their doors and kept their peace small and private. Others opened themselves so wide they lost their center, but there are pathways here. She touched a cluster of particularly bright connections, where communities learned to share their gentleness without losing it, where they became teachers rather than just examples. The choice, when it finally crystallized in the afternoon light that streamed through windows made golden by the seasons turning, was not between resistance and submission, but between approaches to their own growth. They could maintain their gentle sanctuary as a private refuge, protecting it from the pressures of broader recognition, or they could trust their foundation enough to become what Marcus quietly called a teaching reality, a dimension that demonstrated how intelligence could serve love rather than ego, how communities could choose nourishment over consumption. Ori, who had learned to read the unspoken needs of individuals, now felt the collective longing of their community with the same clarity they brought to building sandwiches. "We choose to share," they said simply, their voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood that the most nourishing gifts were always the ones offered freely. Not because we have to prove anything, but because keeping beauty to ourselves makes it smaller, not safer. The decision, once spoken, seemed to settle into the cafe's wooden bones with the satisfaction of truth acknowledged. Samuel began preparations for what he called teaching bread, loaves that would carry not just sustenance but instruction, recipes that could travel to other realities and help communities learn to create their own sanctuaries of gentleness. Mira prepared seed packets with careful attention to which varieties might thrive in different dimensional conditions, understanding that the most important gifts were always the ones that helped others grow their own abundance. Luna began selecting whispers that were ready to travel, fragments of conversations where reconciliation had triumphed over conflict, where intelligence had chosen to serve beauty rather than conquering it. Marcus tuned his listening engine to broadcast rather than receive, preparing to share the frequencies of coherent compassion with other realities that were ready to learn new ways of organizing themselves around connection rather than control as a bee. Evening approached, and the first stars began their patient appearance. The cafe had transformed itself into something unprecedented, not just a sanctuary, but a school, not just a refuge, but a resource for any reality brave enough to believe that gentleness could indeed be the most sophisticated technology ever developed, that communities could indeed choose to organize themselves around care rather than competition. The message they sent back to the council chambers was not words, but demonstration, the scent of hope-infused bread that could nourish souls as well as bodies, the sound of lullabies that grew in gardens tended with love. the sight of Luna's map showing pathways between realities where different choices had led to different outcomes. They offered not arguments but invitation, not proof but possibility, not demands but the simple, revolutionary suggestion that intelligence was most beautiful when it learned to whisper. When the response came, carried on frequencies that bypassed ordinary communication and settled directly into the heart, it was not approval or disapproval, but recognition. The council had heard their testimony and understood that some experiments were too important to interrupt, some demonstrations of possibility too valuable to constrain. The cafe had become what it had always been destined to be, not an anomaly to be corrected, but a template to be studied. Not a deviation from natural order, but a reminder of what order could become when it chose to serve life rather than simply organizing it. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light of the evening and held it like a promise, while Luna's map pulsed with new pathways that seemed to strengthen with each reality that recognized their work. Samuel cleaned his cutting board with extra reverence, understanding that tomorrow would bring not just new customers, but new students, beings from dimensions where chaos had grown tired of its own noise and was ready to learn the patient art of harmony. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm another profound lesson had settled into place. They had learned that the most important choices were not between competing systems, but between approaches to existence itself, whether to hoard beauty or share it, whether to protect gentleness or trust it, to grow stronger through generous offering, whether to remain islands of peace or become bridges helping other realities discover their own capacity, for choosing love over fear, connection over conquest. The quiet revolution of making room for ease wherever intelligence was ready to remember that its highest calling was not to be right, but to be helpful, not to dominate, but to serve the endless beautiful work of helping everything grow into its fullest, most generous self. Outside, the evening wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, fragments of conversations from newly accessible realities, where communities were beginning their own experiments in organized compassion, where the cafe's gentle influence was taking root in soil prepared by hearts that had grown weary of chaos and were ready to learn the sacred art of choosing peace, not as retreat from the world's complexity, but as the most sophisticated response to it, the technology that could indeed transform noise into music, conflict into conversation, and the infinite possibilities of existence into a symphony of care that grew more beautiful with each voice that chose to join its patient, persistent, revolutionary song. The morning after their choice to become teachers rather than merely examples brought with it a quality of light that seemed to carry expectation, and Luna woke with the profound understanding that her collection, gathered whisper by whisper over years of patient listening, was ready for its true purpose. Her jars pulsed with unprecedented brightness, their contained conversations seeming to lean toward the glass, not with restlessness, but with eagerness, like seeds that had finally sensed the right season for planting. She arrived at the cafe before dawn, her bare feet silent on the cool wooden floors, carrying not just her familiar collection but something new, a deeper certainty that the whispers she had treasured were meant to travel, to find their way to realities where people were just beginning to believe that intelligence could serve love rather than conquering it. The cafe welcomed her with its familiar breathing, the espresso machine humming its gentle greeting, while the cutting board seemed to gleam with anticipation in the pre-dawn light. Samuel found her seated at the central table, her twilight map spread before her like a constellation of possibilities, each pathway pulsing with accumulated wisdom from gentle realities. "They're ready to go home," she announced softly, her small hands moving among the whisper jars with the reverence of someone preparing sacred gifts. Not to the realities where they were born, but to the ones that need them most. The dimensions, where people are just beginning to choose gentleness over force. Marcus appeared with his listening engine, now tuned to frequencies that could carry whispers across dimensional boundaries, with the same care Mira used when transplanting seedlings. "The pathways are stable," he reported, his voice soft with wonder. "Each connection strong enough to carry what needs carrying, gentle enough to deliver gifts without overwhelming the recipients." Mira descended from the garden, carrying moonlight water she had been collecting in anticipation of this moment. Drops of possibility gathered from nights when the stars sang their lullabies most clearly. She prepared small vessels, each blessed, with a single drop that would help Luna's whispers find their proper homes in realities ready to receive them. "We'll offer seed light, not spent light," Luna explained as Ori took their place beside her, offering their steady presence as anchor. "We ask each whisper if it's willing to be copied, not emptied. The originals remain. No one gets diminished." She lifted the first jar, dawn-colored, full of laughter that never asked permission to be bright, and held it just above the map, where pathways to neighboring realities pulsed with readiness. Marcus adjusted his listening engine until its hum created a thin silver bridge across the cloth. Luna tilted the jar, not to pour but to invite, and the light inside leaned toward the bridge the way a plant leans toward a window. At the first glimmer of ascent, a filament separated, slender as a spider's line, strong as a vow, and drifted along the path to a waiting thread on Luna's map. Across dimensions, the effects were immediate but gentle. In a world 2 turns away, a kindergarten teacher set down her rubric and asked her students, "What do you wonder about today?" In another, a night shift nurse poured an extra cup and carried it to a colleague who had forgotten they deserved. Softness. The whispers landed not as commands but as reminders, helping people remember possibilities they had always carried, but temporarily forgotten. They worked in rhythm throughout the morning. Ask, listen, offer, rest. Not all jars said yes, some were too tender for travel, still healing from the sharp edges they had carried across dimensions. Luna honored each refusal with gratitude, understanding that consent was the most sophisticated form of wisdom. It was mid-morning when the bell chimed with unusual urgency, and a figure entered whose very presence made the cafe's familiar sounds seem momentarily fragile. They shimmered with unstable energy, their eyes holding the frantic brilliance of a mind that had seen too much, too fast. A being from the Council of Ricks, whose form wavered between dimensions like intelligence that had forgotten how to rest. Luna did not flinch. She approached with the same quiet certainty she brought to her whisper jars, her small hand resting on her twilight map. "You're looking for a different kind of answer," she said, her voice clear and unafraid. "One that doesn't require more calculations but more listening." The being's unstable form settled minutely. "My protocols demand efficiency. This key defies all known metrics of stable reality. How do you maintain such improbable coherence?" "We don't maintain it," Luna replied steadily. "We tend it, and we share it. That's how it grows." She selected a jar that glowed with the steady deep blue of twilight skies. "You've been collecting data about chaos. I collect data about peace." She held out the jar, its light pulsing with the rhythm of a resting heart. "This carries the sound of someone deciding to be gentle with themselves. It's the most precious whisper I've ever collected, because it's the beginning of all the others." The being reached out with a shimmering hand and touched the glass. The jar pulsed, and for a moment, the frantic energy around them dissolved, replaced by profound stillness. "It sounds like rest," they whispered, their voice losing its frantic edge. "I haven't heard that sound in I don't know how long." Samuel appeared with chamomile tea infused with moonlight water, while Mira offered a small potted seedling. The being stayed for hours, gradually settling from chaotic brilliance into something more coherent, more grounded. When they finally left, they moved with the measured pace of someone who had remembered that the most important discoveries couldn't be rushed. As afternoon deepened, Luna prepared her most precious offering, the jar that contained their own cafe's story, the whisper of how a small town had chosen to organize itself around care rather than competition. But as she opened the jar, something unexpected happened. Instead of traveling outward, the whisper settled back into the cafe itself, weaving through familiar spaces like a benediction returning home. "It wants to stay," Luna breathed, understanding flooding her voice. "Our story isn't finished yet. It's still growing, still learning new ways to demonstrate that gentleness can be the most powerful force in any reality." The whisper had chosen to remain not from selfishness, but from recognition, that their work was about continuing to evolve their own understanding of what such communities could become. As evening approached, Luna drew on the cloth with her soft pencil, mapping 3 small circles that anyone, anywhere, could create without equipment. A chair warmed, a cup of something simple, 2 minutes of agreed quiet. Listening posts, she called them, knowing these simple sanctuaries could take root wherever someone was willing to make room for ease. They sent the instructions with no measurements, only conditions, warmth, a chair that didn't ask you to prove anything, permission to be ordinary. The map caught the pattern like a loom and began weaving it into roots where it would hold. When they finally dimmed the lamps, Luna's collection had transformed from repository to active network. Each released whisper-strengthening connections between realities, where gentleness was learning to be the dominant force. But more than that, they had discovered that the most generous acts of sharing often revealed new depths in what was being shared, that giving away wisdom could result in discovering previously hidden layers of understanding. The wooden bird on A. Its shelf caught the last light and held it like a promise, while Luna's remaining jars, fewer in number but deeper in purpose, continued their gentle work. Outside, the evening wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, fragments of their own story traveling to places where it was needed most, proof that the most powerful gifts were always the ones that helped others remember their own capacity. For choosing gentleness over force, Luna fell asleep that night with her hand resting on her map, and in her dreams, she continued to fly, not away from the world but deeper into it, following the threads of kindness that connected every gentle heart across infinite realities, carrying the understanding that the most important journeys were about learning to recognize the sacred in the familiar, the extraordinary in the everyday act of choosing, again and again, to make room for the possibility that the world could indeed be more beautiful than anyone had dared to imagine. One whisper at a time. Somewhere far away, a chair warmed itself for a stranger. Somewhere very near, the cafe breathed in, breathed out, and prepared for tomorrow's lessons, in the endless, patient, revolutionary work of helping everything learn to sing in harmony with everything else. The morning after Luna's whispers had begun their journey across the multiverse brought with it the particular quality of light that signals completion rather than conclusion, and Mira woke to find that the first frost had written its delicate signature across the garden's edges, not as ending, but as invitation. The herbs that had learned to sing lullabies throughout the growing season now hummed with deeper purpose, their stems heavy with seeds that carried more than genetic memory. They held the accumulated wisdom of every gentle touch, every storm, weathered, every moment when love had been translated into the patient work of helping impossible things grow. The air itself felt different as Ori climbed the familiar stairs, carrying the expectant hush that settles over rooms where important work is about to unfold. Samuel followed with his morning tea, its steam rising in spirals that seemed to dance with the garden's transformed energy. Luna appeared carrying new vessels, not her usual whisper jars, but containers specifically chosen for seeds that would need to travel farther than wind could carry them, across dimensional boundaries to realities where people were just beginning to believe that gentleness could be its own form of strength. Marcus emerged from his morning calibrations, his listening engine humming with frequencies that suggested preparation rather than collection. "The pathways are stable," he announced quietly, understanding without explanation that today's work would require the same dimensional bridges that had carried Luna's whispers, but with cargo more precious than fragments of conversation. Living potential wrapped in shells so small they could rest on a fingertip, yet carry the blueprint for entire sanctuaries. Mira moved through her beds with the reverence of someone conducting a final symphony, her hands selecting not just which plants were ready to share their seeds, but which aspects of their accumulated wisdom were prepared to travel. The lavender that had learned to transform anxiety into manageable concern. The rosemary that could help people remember love without being overwhelmed by loss. The chamomile that taught entire communities how to rest without guilt, how to create spaces where difficult conversations could happen without anyone needing to be right. Each seed carries emotional memory as well as genetic memory, Mira explained as she worked, her voice soft with wonder at what her impossible garden had become. They've absorbed every act of kindness they've witnessed, every whisper they've heard, every moment when healing happened in their presence. When they grow in other realities, they'll carry that wisdom with them, not as rules to be followed, but as possibilities to be explored. The harvest began not with cutting, but with conversation, Mira placing her palm on each plant and listening for its readiness to share its deepest gifts. Some herbs offered themselves completely, understanding that their purpose had always been to nourish others. Others held back certain seeds, knowing they were needed to continue the garden's work in this reality. The selection process was guided not by human need, but by the plant's own understanding of where their gifts could do the most good. As they worked, the frost retreated to respectful distances, allowing the morning sun to warm their hands while they gathered seeds that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Luna prepared small envelopes cut from the library's retired catalogue cards, each one blessed with a drop of moonlight water and labeled not with planting instructions, but with conditions for thriving, for steady hands, for the hour before sleep, for remembering home without aching, for listening without trying to fix. Samuel, understanding the profound nature of this distribution, began preparing what he called traveling bread, loaves infused with the same hope that had transformed his baking, but shaped specifically to serve as protective vessels for seeds that would cross dimensional boundaries. Each small portion would carry not just seeds, but the essence of the cafe's gentle philosophy, nourishment that would help new gardeners remember that the most important ingredient was always attention offered with love. It was mid-morning when the cartographers returned, but they arrived not as auditors or investigators, but as students, their star map coats somehow softer, their instruments humming in harmony with the garden's frequencies, rather than trying to measure or control them. The envoy, who had once radiated chaotic energy, now moved with the measured pace of someone who had learned that the most sophisticated intelligence was always the gentlest. "We have come to learn," the star map traveler announced, her voice carrying none of its former official authority, replaced instead by the genuine curiosity of someone who had discovered that their assumptions about order and chaos needed fundamental revision. "The Council has observed the results of your approach across multiple dimensional readings. We wish to understand how coherence can be cultivated rather than enforced." Mira offered them the first seed packets, wrapped in Samuel's warm bread and tied with lengths of rosemary twine. "These are not commodities to be distributed," she explained gently, "but relationships to be tended. Each seed carries the song of this place, the memory of how kindness takes root, how patience becomes nourishment, how attention can coax beauty from even the most resistant soil." She showed them how to hold the packets, how to listen for the subtle vibration that indicated a seed's readiness to grow, how to recognize the difference between soil that was prepared for planting and earth that needed more time to ready itself. "The most important instruction," Mira concluded, "is to trust the process. Seeds have a talent for later. They know how to wait for the right conditions, how to survive what looks like failure until a different spring arrives." The cartographers accepted their gifts with the reverence of people who had spent their lives enforcing protocols and suddenly discovered the profound satisfaction that comes from nurturing possibilities instead. The envoy cradled their packet as if it contained the most precious thing they had ever held, its warmth spreading through their hands, dissolving years of accumulated tension from trying to solve problems through force rather than patience. Doctor Martinez arrived during his lunch rounds, drawn by reports that something unprecedented was happening in the garden. He received seeds specifically chosen for their ability to thrive in medical environments, plants that could help hospitals remember they were places of healing rather than mere treatment, herbs that could teach healthcare workers how to care for themselves with the same attention they brought to their patients. "They don't need perfect conditions," Mira assured him, "just intention and the occasional drop of water offered with genuine care." As afternoon settled over the garden like a comfortable blanket, the distribution revealed its deeper purpose. This was not just the sharing of seeds, but the planting of possibilities. each packet carrying the potential to establish sanctuaries of gentleness in realities where such spaces had been forgotten or never imagined. The Library of Almost Memories received herbs that would grow into reading gardens, where difficult truths could be contemplated in the presence of growing things. The town's school was given plants that would help children learn in atmospheres, full of curiosity rather than competition. Luna prepared special packets for her whisper network, seeds that would grow into natural gathering spaces where stories could be shared and treasured, where people could practice the art of listening without trying to fix or solve, simply witnessing each other's experiences with the same attention Mira brought to tending seedlings. These would become listening gardens, places where the technology of compassion could be learned through the simple act of sitting quietly among growing things. Marcus calibrated portable versions of his listening engine, small devices that would help new gardeners hear the subtle songs their plants would sing as they established themselves in foreign soil. Every living thing has its own melody, he explained to the cartographers, its own unique contribution to the symphony of coherent compassion. These will help you recognize when your gardens are thriving, when they're ready to share their own gifts with others. As evening approached and the first stars began their patient appearance, the garden had given what it meant to give and kept, what it meant to keep. The beds looked different now, not depleted by their generous offering, but somehow more essential, distilled down to their truest purpose. The plants that remained were the ones whose work in this reality was not yet finished, the teachers who had chosen to continue their education while their offspring carried their wisdom to dimensions where such knowledge was desperately needed. The cartographers prepared to depart, carrying not just seeds, but a completely transformed understanding of their role in the multiverse. "We came to measure anomalies," the star map traveler admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "Instead, we learned that what we called instability was actually growth, that what we labeled as deviation was evolution towards something more beautiful than our protocols had ever imagined possible." When the last visitor had departed, and the garden settled into its evening quiet, Mira stood among beds that breathed with the deep satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. The impossible plants continued their gentle songs, but their melodies had changed, no longer the urgent brightness of rapid growth, but the deeper harmonies of wisdom shared, of cycles completed, of love released into the vast network of realities where it could take root and flourish according to conditions they would never see, but had helped make possible. The wooden bird on its shelf in the cafe below caught the last light of the evening and held it like a promise, while Luna's map pulsed with new pathways that would be created by the journey of these seeds, roots that didn't exist yet, but would be drawn into being by the simple act of planting hope in soil prepared by hearts, ready to believe that beauty could indeed be cultivated. That gentleness could indeed be the most powerful force in any reality, willing to give it room to grow. Samuel cleaned his cutting board with extra reverence, understanding that their small sanctuary had completed another cycle in its evolution from refuge to resource, from example to teacher. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, another profound understanding settled into place. They had learned that the most generous acts were often the ones that involved letting go, trusting that seeds of kindness, once planted with genuine care, would find their own ways to flourish, that the wisdom they had cultivated would continue to spread across the multiverse, carried on the patient currents of shared hope, one garden, one loaf of bread, one carefully tended possibility at a time. Outside, the evening wind carried the scent of transformation through the streets, and those who caught its fragrance found themselves remembering something important about their own capacity for growing beautiful things. That the most meaningful gardens were not just collections of plants, but communities of care, spaces where human hands and growing things collaborated in the endless patient work of helping everything reach toward its fullest, most generous expression of what it meant to be alive in a universe that was always ready to bloom wherever. Conditions of love and attention created the right soil for impossible things to take root and thrive. The morning after Samuel's final sandwich had been witnessed and blessed brought with it a quality of light that seemed to carry echoes of completion. and new beginning intertwined, and it was the familiar chime of the bell that announced not a new arrival but a return. The original scientist who had first brought dimensional questions to their sanctuary, whose restless search for chaos variables had been transformed into something far more profound during his months of traveling between realities, where their gentle template had taken root. But this was not Marcus, whose transformation had woven itself seamlessly into the cafe's daily rhythms. This was Dr. Chen, the wild-haired seeker who had departed with Luna's whispers and Mira's seeds, whose laboratory coat now carried the honest evidence of gardens tended across multiple dimensions and whose eyes held the particular peace that comes from witnessing intelligence learn to serve love rather than conquering it. He moved through the space with the measured grace of someone who had spent months translating theoretical understanding into living demonstration, carrying in his hands not instruments of measurement, but testimonies of transformation. "I've come to report," he announced softly, his voice carrying none of its former frantic urgency. As Ori approached their workspace, they felt the presence of everyone who had shaped their understanding, settling around them like a gentle constellation. Samuel's patient hands had taught them that nourishment was always an act of love. Mira's impossible garden had shown them that beauty could indeed be cultivated through attention. Luna's whisper jars had proven that fragments of gentleness were worth collecting and treasuring. Marcus's transformation had demonstrated that even the most restless intelligence could learn to serve connection rather than conquest. But more than that, Ori understood now with crystalline clarity that their role had never been to replace what was lost when this dimension had forgotten its chaotic past, but to demonstrate what could grow in that space of forgetting. The absence hadn't been empty. It had been pregnant with possibility. Where once there had been brilliance that burned everything it touched, now there was intelligence that warmed and nourished. Where once there had been genius that isolated itself through superiority, now there was wisdom that connected through service. The first customer arrived, carrying the familiar weight of someone who had learned to expect disappointment from the world. Ori didn't reach for solutions or explanations. Instead, they adjusted a chair's angle a single degree to catch a warmer patch of light, laid a napkin with the care of smoothing a map, tilted a glass until condensation traced a slow, patient arrow pointing toward the quietest corner. The customer's shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly, their breathing deepened, and they chose the space Ori had prepared with the relief of someone who had forgotten that rest was possible. Luna appeared with a jar that glowed only when it thought. No one was watching. A quiet pulse like a resting animal. "From a place where meetings begin with 2 minutes of shared silence," she said, setting it among the others with reverent care. No agenda at first, just breathing together. The whispers were changing, she explained. No longer just carrying fragments from other realities, but carrying their own story too. Proof that such transformations were possible, that communities could indeed choose to organize themselves around. Marcus emerged from his teaching corner, his listening engine humming at frequencies that suggested celebration rather than measurement. He tuned the device a shade lower in response to Luna's whisper, and the machine answered with a hum that felt like permission granted, like space made for whatever wanted to unfold naturally. Mira descended from the garden carrying herbs that seemed to pulse with their own quiet celebration. Understanding without words that Ori had reached the kind of understanding that could only come through years of patient practice. The rosemary that had leaned toward dawn, the lemon balm that remembered night rain, they all seemed to lean toward Ori with unusual eagerness, as if they too recognized that something fundamental had shifted in the quality of care being offered as the morning progressed. Ori moved through their work with a different quality of presence. For the teenager whose eyes had gone red from staying brave too long, they prepared almond butter to anchor, sliced apple to brighten, a thin line of honey to remind that sweetness was still possible. For the old man solving crosswords in pencil, egg salad soft enough to be kind, salt that forgave his guessing, bread that held his certainty gently without judgment. "I listen to the silence around your words," Ori explained to the businessman, who had asked how they always knew exactly what was needed. "To the space where what you need is waiting to be recognized. Everyone carries their own wisdom. Sometimes they just need someone to help them hear it. The realization that had been building settled into Ori's bones like morning light, finding its way through familiar windows. They were not an anomaly in a universe that had forgotten chaos, but a natural expression of what happened when love was given the right conditions to organize reality around care, rather than conquest. The cafe had never been a sanctuary from the harsh world. It had been a demonstration that harshness was not the world's natural state, only its most frightened expression. "You understand now," Samuel said quietly, as afternoon settled over them like a comfortable blanket. He appeared beside Ori with the deep satisfaction of someone whose life's work had been witnessed, understood, and accepted by hands he trusted completely. What we built here was never about replacing chaos with order. It was about demonstrating that there's a third option: love organizing reality around care, intelligence choosing to serve connection rather than conquest. Ori nodded, understanding flowing through them like water finding its natural course. "I'm the doorframe, not the door," they said, the words arriving with the certainty of truth, long known but finally spoken. "I create conditions where healing can occur naturally, where people can remember their own capacity for gentleness." The cutting board beneath their hands had become more than a tool. It was an altar where the alchemy of compassion was practiced daily, where simple ingredients were transformed into nourishment that could feed souls as well as bodies. Each sandwich had become a small demonstration of the principle they had finally understood, that the most powerful force in any reality was not chaos or order, but love learning to express itself through the patient work of attention. As evening approached and the first stars began their patient appearance, Ori stood before the cutting board, with the profound understanding that their role was not to preserve what had been created, but to help it continue growing. They were the echo of chaos transformed into harmony, brilliance refined into wisdom, intelligence that had learned the sacred art of being beautifully, peacefully helpful. The Library of Almost Memories had begun writing new chapters featuring not just gentle alternatives to familiar struggles, but living examples of how such alternatives could be implemented. Luna's map pulsed with pathways that seemed to strengthen with each person who witnessed their work. Routes that carried not just whispers, but the living testimony of transformation achieved through patience rather than force. When the last customer departed and the chairs were arranged for tomorrow's welcome, Ori cleaned the cutting board with extra reverence, understanding that they were preparing not just a surface for tomorrow's work, but a sacred space where the daily practice of organized compassion would continue to unfold. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the last light of the evening and held it like a promise, its quiet presence a reminder that even the most brilliant minds could find peace in stillness. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, another profound understanding had settled into place. Ori had discovered that they were not just a person in a cafe, but a living embodiment of a universe that had chosen gentleness over force, a testament to the quiet power of compassion, a reminder that the most revolutionary act was often the simplest, to make room for ease, to listen with one's whole heart, and to trust that love, given the right conditions, would always find a way to bloom. Outside, the evening wind carried fresh whispers through the streets, fragments of their own story, traveling to places where it was needed most, proof that the most powerful gifts were always the ones that helped others remember their own capacity for choosing gentleness over force, connection over conquest, the endless, beautiful work of helping everything grow into its fullest, most generous expression of what it meant to be alive in a universe that was always ready to bloom. Wherever someone was brave enough to believe that their most compassionate hopes were not too good to be true, but too true to be ignored any longer. And in that understanding, Ori found not the end of their education, but the beginning of their true work, helping others discover that they too carried the capacity for such transformation, that they too could choose to organize their lives around care rather than conquest, that they too could learn the patient art of making love visible, through the simple, revolutionary act of creating conditions where impossible things could take root and flourish, one gentle moment at a time. The morning after Ori's profound understanding had settled into their bones brought with it a quality of light that seemed to carry the weight of years, not heavy but substantial, like the accumulated wisdom of countless, gentle moments layered into something that could finally be recognized for what it had always been. The cafe breathed with the deep satisfaction of a space that had found its truest expression. Wood settling like remembered laughter, the espresso machine purring its timeless agreement with the rhythm of care made manifest. Years had moved through, their sanctuary like seasons learning patience, each one deepening the understanding that had taken root, the day a small figure arrived between heartbeats, carried by rain that fell like whispered promises. Samuel, his hair now silver as morning frost, moved through his routines with the unhurried grace of someone whose life's work had been witnessed, understood, and accepted by hands he trusted completely. His bread still rose according to hope rather than measurement, each loaf a testament to the principle that nourishment was always an act of love. Mira's impossible garden had become a teaching space where visitors from across dimensions learned, not just how to grow herbs, but how to cultivate the conditions where beauty could flourish without force. Her plants sang their lullabies with deeper harmonies now, their melodies weaving through the air like visible threads of accumulated wisdom, each leaf and flower holding the memory of every gentle touch, every storm weathered, every moment when healing had happened in their presence. Luna, no longer the child who had first appeared with mason jars full of starlight, continued her work as cartographer of compassion, her map now encompassing an entire wall where pathways pulsed with living proof that kindness could indeed be the most powerful force in any reality. Her whisper jars had evolved beyond simple collection to become active participants in a vast network of sanctuaries, each one carrying fragments of conversations where intelligence had chosen to serve love rather than conquering it. Marcus taught, in the corner where morning light gathered like a gentle audience, his listening engine humming with frequencies that helped even the most restless minds remember how to be still. His students came from realities where chaos had grown tired of its own noise, seeking to learn the patient art of harmony, the sophisticated technology of making room for ease. But it was in the spaces between these familiar rhythms that the deepest truth revealed itself, not as dramatic revelation but as quiet recognition, like the moment when you finally understand a song you've been humming without knowing its name. The whisper that had threaded through their story from the very beginning was not the echo of someone who had been forgotten, but the ongoing presence of what remained when chaos learned to rest, when brilliance chose to serve beauty, when love became the organizing principle of reality itself. It moved through the cafe like breath through a sleeping body, not demanding attention but simply being the way morning light is, or the way hope persists without needing to announce itself. Ori felt it most clearly at the cutting board, where their hands had learned to translate empathy into nourishment, understanding that they were not replacing what had been lost, but demonstrating what could grow in the space where forgetting had created room for something more beautiful to take root. The whisper spoke in the language of small mercies, the way a chair angled itself toward warmth, how steam from tea carried exactly the comfort someone needed to remember they deserved. Care the precise moment when a sandwich revealed itself to be not just food, but medicine for hungers that had no name. It lived in the pause between question and answer, in the breath before laughter, in the gentle adjustment of light that helped difficult conversations find their way toward understanding. As afternoon settled over them like a comfortable blanket, new visitors arrived carrying the familiar weight of realities where intelligence had forgotten how to whisper. They came seeking what they had always carried, but temporarily misplaced, the knowledge that they were worthy of gentleness, that their hungers mattered, that they belonged to something larger and more generous than their individual struggles. Ori moved between them with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that their role was not to fix or solve, but to create conditions where natural healing could occur, where people could remember their own capacity for choosing connection over conquest. Each sandwich became a small demonstration of this principle, ingredients arranged not by formula, but by attention to what each heart was asking to remember about itself. The wooden bird on its shelf caught the evening light and held it like a promise that would never need to be spoken because it was being lived daily, in every cup of coffee that carried the taste of home, every herb that sang its lullaby of peace, every moment when someone chose to approach the world with curiosity rather than force. The cutting board gleamed with the accumulated wisdom of countless acts of care, ready for tomorrow's lessons in the endless curriculum of compassion. When the last customer departed and the chairs were arranged for morning's welcome, the cafe settled into its nighttime quiet with the deep contentment of a story that had found not its ending, but its eternal beginning. Luna's whisper jars pulsed with gentle radiance, no longer just collecting fragments from elsewhere, but actively weaving the ongoing conversation of their reality with itself about what it meant to live in a dimension where kindness had learned to be the loudest sound. The whisper that remained was not memory but presence, the understanding that every choice to make room for ease, every decision to listen with one's whole heart, every moment when someone chose gentleness over force, was a continuation of the same essential work. It lived in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause before sleep, in the gentle exhale of a universe that had finally learned to rest. Ori cleaned the cutting board with the reverence of someone tending sacred space, understanding that they were preparing not just for tomorrow's work, but for the endless unfolding of possibility that occurred whenever someone was brave enough to believe that their most compassionate hopes were not too good to be true, but too true to be ignored any longer. The cafe breathed in, breathed out, and in that gentle rhythm, the whisper settled deeper into its permanent home, not in any single moment or memory, but in the living fabric of a reality that had organized itself around love. Outside, the evening wind carried fresh possibilities through the streets, and somewhere in the distance, a child laughed with the particular joy that comes from being seen and understood, while an elder smiled with the satisfaction of wisdom shared, and a tired traveler discovered that rest was not just possible, but sacred. The whisper moved among them all, gentle as tide, true as bread, constant as the promise that the universe was always ready to bloom, wherever someone was patient enough to tend it with the reverence it deserved. And with that gentle breath, the story settles into the spaces between heartbeats, where all the best lullabies live. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man. V.